It won't be business as usual anymore as lecturers in any tertiary institution who engages in sexual harassment of students risk 14 years imprisonment. Aside this, offenders may also be fined 5 million naira. This forms the core of the sexual harassment bill recently passed by the Senate, and it is hoped will put an end to this prevailing menace in the country's higher institutions. Now, will this effort bring sanity to Nigerian universities and serve as a deterrent to lecturers? And what are the other offences in this bracket? Well, answers to these questions and more shortly on this edition of Nigeria Today. I am Dennis Adigunloye. Welcome to the program. All right, with me in the studio to discuss the sexual harassment bill is Frank Tietie, a human rights lawyer and executive director, Citizens Advocacy for Social and Economic Rights. Kesa, you're very welcome to Nigeria Today.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And also joining us via Skype from Enugu is Professor Joy Izeilu, Dean, Faculty of Law, University of Nigeria, Nsukka. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, let me come to you first, Prof. When we talk about sexual harassment, just give us your broad definition of what it exactly entails.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sexual harassment, by definition, is unwanted advances of non-consensual nature, whether it could be verbal, it could be physical, it could also be by physical, verbal, and explicit conduct. So if you look at it, the measure of the government is unwanted. So it's an unwanted physical, verbal, or visual sexual advances for sexual fervor and other sexually oriented conduct. So it's like quid pro quo. If you give me this, you get this. So it includes situations where a person is asked to engage in sexual activity as a condition, for either, and in the context of tertiary education, for you to pass your exam. So it becomes like sex for marks, sex for grade kind of thing. And in employment situation as well, it could also, it has its own socioeconomic implication. Okay, if you don't do this, then you don't get promotion or even get confirmed or anything. So it can happen in different setups. But I think the one that has become a hydra-headed problem for which we are concerned is the issue of sexual harassment in tertiary education, which becomes kind of ultimate betrayal of trust, of moral, of ethical standards, because when you talk about sexual harassment, it has also different implications. It has the moral dimension, the ethical dimension, and it also has the socioeconomic implication beyond, because it also affects, even if within tertiary institutions, including academic and non-academic staff. It for long, under the law, it lacked, because we know about sexual assault, of course, and then they are defined, the punishments are clear. But under our law, whether federal or state laws, the criminal law, there is no, there have been absence of criminalization of the offense of sexual harassment. Even in the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Bill that was adopted in FCT and respective states, it was still missing that we don't have sexual harassment defined. So that is the importance of this bill that was passed yesterday by the Senate, because it will be the first time that the law is criminalizing it in a clear terms. And that's what we need, to have a coherent policy that deals with this, because until there is such accountability, then people will not can get away with it. So if you look at what they have, is a useful beginning to have a law, now, I mean, it's still a bill, of course, and then it will still have to go to House of Representatives for both concurrent and then harmonization, etc. So, but having passed there, and if you look at the number of senators, I think virtually all of them could sponsor the bill that was presented by Senator, His Excellency, I think the Deputy Senate President, Omar Agege, who presented this bill. So it has unanimous support of entire Senate. So I don't think it will be delayed at all in the House of Rep. And it's one bill whose time has come because of because of the implication. And again, it's also apart from raising the accountability stake, we need safe environment for our students, and we need to make sure that the fiduciary relationship between an educator and a student is respected. And when that is breached, that there is a punishment.
All right, can I just stop you there, Prof?
To prevent it and redress sexual harassment.
All right, Prof, I'll come back to you. Let me come to our guest in the studio, Executive Director, Citizens Advocacy for Social and Economic Rights, Frank Tietie. You've heard a lot of what has been said there, and quite clearly this is a bill that needs to be, no doubt, expedited through the system and brought into law in terms of, curbing this menace of sexual harassment, particularly in higher institutions.
Oh yes, I think it's a welcome development. I must commend the Senate for this response, even though for people like us, we thought it was coming too late because it has become a norm in the higher institutions that either it's sex for marks or certain predatory behavior on the part of lecturers on female students. So to think that it was allowed to get to this alarming level before we are having this bill that is ultimately going to become a law, and it's very much welcome. And it also circumvents the trouble that we've had in having the standards that were set, the new standards of sexual behavior that were set in the Violence Against Persons Act that were only seemingly applicable into in the FCT. Now it raises the bar, the moral standards demanded from lecturers, and I think it's supposed not to be only for lecturers, but I think is a good starting point. The thing is this: a lot more ought to have been done before now. But the bill appears to be hurriedly put together because I think that the epidemic level of cases of sexual harassment, which ultimately lead to sexual violation, sexual and gender-based violence, is something that has become very, very troubling and indeed a national embarrassment to us right now.
All right. Some quarters have criticized the punishments put forward for sexual harassment as not being adequate. Would you share this view?
No, I think the punishments are adequate. It recommended punishments of between 5 and 14 years, and then the fines of 2 million, 5 million, and I think they're adequate. What I find very interesting is lowering the standard of proof. Because we're dealing with a crime here, it ought to be proof beyond reasonable doubt, which is usually very difficult in matters of sexual offenses. But to now think that the standard of proof that is required for civil matters is now applicable to a criminal offense in the nature of sexual harassment, it's very encouraging. That is, even though I find a problem with the expanse to which the sexual harassment is defined in the bill, which includes things like winking and touching. Of course, touching that is unwanted, according to what Prof said, has always been an offense in Nigeria under our criminal laws. It's called assault. But to now narrow it to the tertiary institution is a welcome development. But the proof is that you only need a few persons corroborating what the complainant has said or made, the allegations of the complainant to actually ground the offense of sexual harassment against the student. And now this will be very, very interesting times in our tertiary institutions because the norm is about to change in such a dramatic manner.
You talk about the burden of proof being reduced. What if you have a situation where for whatever reason, somebody is being maliciously targeted, and more than a few people now make allegations which are not true.
That, of course, no law is perfect, but we just have to have a starting place. And that's when I look at all, there are several loopholes in that, in the bill as it is. But what's important is that there is also some measure of sufficient provision for fair hearing. For example, there has to be a committee that includes members of the student body and then academic and non-academic staff, and, you know, a fair looking, fairly constituted body committee to look into the allegations. It's not just a blanket, you know, condemnation or criminalization or acceptance of the allegations. They will all be considered reasonably by a committee who will make recommendations ultimately to the chief executive, and I find that as a big problem, because holding the chief executive, or that is as the administrator of a tertiary institution, to be accountable for complaints of sexual harassment, I think is something that they need to consider when the bill goes for harmonization. It's quite risky in that regard, and can possibly truncate the harmony in the university system.
All right, coming back to you, Prof. Give us your take on this reduction of burden of proof on these cases of sexual harassment. Do you feel that there'll be any loopholes that could be taken advantage of, or any potential miscarriages of justice when we're talking about reducing the bar in terms of burden of proof?
No, it will not, because already the way the nature of offense is and the circumstances, you see, it's not like clearly where you can look at other ingredients of the offense. For example, you know, if it's rape, you can say, okay, we must have sex unlawful without consent, with penetration must be part of it, corroboration and all of that. But in sexual harassment, it's not like it's a different connotation. That's why winking can be part of it. That's why it is physical, it is verbal, and it's non-verbal. And when you send sexually explicit text, that should complete the offense. So it doesn't require, you know, extraordinary. So I like the fact that it's framed in that way. Otherwise, if the burden of proof becomes of the same, you know, proof beyond reasonable and all of that, then it becomes very difficult, because I say, you say, and then, but if there are, of course, the circumstances, you know, that proves that, and of course it's investigated. There is independent sexual harassment committee that is very robust with persons. Though I have a problem with regard to membership of that, in terms of not just saying a person's of moral, ethical, how do you just make sure that they don't have any of those charges against them? You know, how, and I believe I still need a bit of strengthening in that aspect of the bill. But it covers a process that can give everyone fair hearing. And once that it is, then you have to decide on the balance of probability. So I think, yeah, so to that extent, it brings in the civil aspect. And I think also it could be also the redress that is incorporated there, but not quite developed in a sophisticated manner, could be part of that. But I like the element of minimum sentencing. 14 years is fine, is adequate, is an assault, is an assault of sexual nature. And then the minimum, of course, people can say they don't like the idea of minimum sentencing, but we need something proportionate to the offense. And we're trying to cure an ill, because you have to look at what is the mischief behind this. There are evidence and data that show that 1 out of every 3 students will be a victim of sexual harassment in the course of their career, in the course of their educational, so it is something, it's unacceptable. And that's why it has to have a minimum sentence. But again, of course, there is the fine and the responsibility.
If you just hold that thought, please, Prof. We'll take a break now. We'll come back to you on that point. The program is Nigeria Today, and we are discussing the sexual harassment bill recently passed by the Senate. We'll be back shortly after this break. Do stay with us.
The number of the COVID-19 cases in Nigeria is increasing daily, with many more tests ongoing. The battle of testing, isolating, treating, and attending to the affected persons rests heavily on the shoulders of our health workers, constantly putting their lives on the line and at risk to contain this virus, save and protect the lives of millions of Nigerians. To these health workers, we at the Nigerian Television Authority, NTA, on behalf of millions of Nigerians, say a big thank you for all that you have done and are doing. To the security agencies enforcing the lockdown and every other frontliner, we say thank you for putting your lives on the line to save ours. There is no amount of words that can quantify our gratitude. Thank you. This message is brought to you by the Nigerian Television Authority, NTA, Africa's largest television network.
All right, you're welcome back. If you're just joining us, you're on to Nigeria Today, and our topic is the sexual harassment bill passed by the Senate. Our guests are Frank Tietie, human rights lawyer and executive director, Citizens Advocacy for Social and Economic Rights, CASA, and by Skype is Joy Ezelo, Dean, Faculty of Law, University of Nigeria, Nsukka. All right, let me come back to you here in the studio, Frank. We often talk about laws, adequate laws in Nigeria, but there's always the issue of enforcement and implementation. What are your concerns once this law is eventually passed in terms of getting successful convictions and prosecutions?
I think we might experience a change in this time around, because the problem of sexual harassment ultimately affects everybody, the entire society. We all have one interest or the other as stakeholders in the university system, either our children or relatives in general. So it's something that touches on the moral fabric of the society. And now to think that one thing that we mustn't overlook in this bill that is coming is that any act of sexual intercourse between a student and a lecturer is an offense. So it's a strict liability. It's like a strict liability offense. That is, so long, it doesn't matter whether there is consent or the other. So it's actually raising the bar in a very serious way. And that shows the mindset that the lawmakers and indeed the society mean business when in trying to break this law. For us, we thought this law is coming too late. So we've had the problem of implementation, especially in the area of law enforcement. But this is beyond the police. This gives, even though the definition of the Attorney General there, it involves the Attorney General, it's assumed that it includes the Attorney General of the Federation and the Attorney General of the state, and then the police. And then the very thing which I fear is that it imposes a huge burden on the head of an institution, like the Vice Chancellor, the Rector, the Provost, which I think is not fair. Prof, for example, is Dean of the Faculty of Law. She should be able to, by law, constitute a panel to look into a complaint by a female student in the Faculty of Law, University of Nigeria. But you don't consider, arresting the Vice Chancellor of a university and sending him to prison for failing to constitute a committee within 7 days. I think it's important to broaden the number of persons who are responsible for taking complaints that come from female students. We need to understand this, even though there is protection for the male student, but the female student is in the receiving end. Finally, you see, there is something that one would have expected from the law, because the law shouldn't only consider being punitive. It should also consider prevention. It should invest more of its provisions in prevention. So one would have thought that there should have been a provision demanding a sexual harassment policy from all tertiary institutions. That would be very helpful, because now a law is coming where a norm has been sex for grades and then demand predatory sex by lecturers, and suddenly, without any orientation before now, I think that we might just experience what we call, a hike in complaints, because it will be very exciting for the female students in the Nigerian universities right now.
Yeah, Professor Joy, what's your take on this idea of implementing sexual harassment policies in the tertiary institutions?
I don't have a problem with it, but I agree that the prevention dimension of the bill is weak, because we have to also remember the title is, is prevention, prohibition, and seeking redress. That we need to, because this is a social ill, and it's the menace. It's something that I've eaten deep into the fact. So people need to be sensitized and enlightened about it. But I think as soon as we can get up to speed with it. Once they know this is criminalized, I expect that there will be compulsory, not only compulsory awareness in every institution, and then the vice chancellor knowing now the burden on them, and then the likelihood of their being penalized and even losing their position, they will also take it very seriously. Even though I expect that there is a big problem with jurisdiction, and my learned friend there will agree, because even when it comes to its implementation, there will be a jurisdictional issue. Because of the constitutional, with regard to concurrence, the state will have to also make law. But federal institutions, obviously, it can apply to all of the federal universities. Then we also look at to what extent that could be applicable, and other states may start adopting it. But I think what we need also, in addition, there are gaps even that require that we can feel as one goes on, even when it goes for harmonization. The issue, I don't think, is going to lead to increase, because if you look at the power relations, even the context through which this happened, people are even afraid to report ordinarily because they don't want to be victimized, they don't want to be stigmatized, they just want to pass and graduate. So, and again, we have to also not limit it to just student or female student. And you have to also look at it that is also be gender neutral, so which is good and is a good balance. And the fact that also people within the academic institution, other than lecturers, can also be violators. And that is also what happened. We have seen cases that we found out that have nothing to do with lecturers. It could be people who are either technologists assisting in the lab. It could be non-academic staff who have to compile and deal with their results. So who are doing all the sorting and sex for marks and stuff like that. So everyone will have to, then there are other issues that they have to fill. What category of students that will become members of this committee? Then it has to be specified. And there are areas that I think that needs to be strengthened in terms of student, even support for students who are harassed, who will need psychological, psychosocial support, who will provide that, given the likelihood of traumatic stress disorder. So if they have that, what happens? And then if they are unable because of this, even to sit for an exam, what other remedies? But of course, even introducing the idea of redress within that same bill, which is, of course, the new way of there is emerging jurisprudence in terms of possibility of having compensation, even in a criminal matter like that.
Thanks for that,
then
Prof.
This might also become a problem.
Okay.
So we have to investigate that there may be a problem. Have to
that will be a topic for another day, Prof. Our time is fast spent, but thanks for sharing your thoughts with us on that. Let me just quickly come to Frank in the studio here. Just give us your concluding thoughts on this
We're going to have a generation of more assertive female students graduating and coming into the society with this kind of bill. And we're also going to have a university environment that has lecturers, male lecturers, that are more humble and very much afraid of female students now. And I think there's going to be a change in the in the equation of female students and male lecturers relationship, and that's why it creates some worry for me, because when you expand so much the crime of sexual harassment to include winking as innocuous as it may be, then every male lecturer in the university should now be very afraid.
Very careful.
Very, very careful and be afraid indeed.
In other countries, winking is just a simple greeting and nothing is read into it.
No, so long as there is somebody corroborating it, gets into trouble. And that, for winking, can go to jail.
Sure. All right, Frank Tietie, human rights lawyer and executive director, Citizens Advocacy for Social and Economic Rights. CASA, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us on this topic.
My pleasure.
And thanks goes to you, Professor Joy Izelu, Professor of Law and Dean, Faculty of Law, University of Nigeria, Nsukka. Many thanks for taking the time to be with us and sharing with us your thoughts.
Thank you.
And thanks to you out there for watching. And remember, Nigeria Today airs every weekday at 7:30 p.m. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow with another edition. I'm Dennis Adigunloye. Thanks for your time.